Hi everyone, this is Jill Hurston with Synerzip. Welcome to our webinar today. I'd like to apologize for any mishap we had with the time of the start time, but I'm glad you all are able to join us. Just want to remind you I am recording today's session and it will be available tomorrow. I'll send you a direct link with the recording and the slides so that you can have direct access to hear it on demand or forward it to anybody else. Also like to remind you that during the presentation, if at any time you have any questions, please just type it into the chat box and we will get to them as best we can. Given that, I'm going to introduce our moderator today, Amit Narawane. He's with Synerzip over in India. Amit, why don't you take it over?
Sure. Thanks, Jill. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Design Sprint Process. As Jill mentioned, I work here as a Senior Product Manager with Synerzip. Before we start, just a quick few pointers regarding the webinar. As Jill mentioned, we are recording the webinar and the link for which will be sent via email to all the participants. Please feel free to add a question for our speaker as the session continues. We'll make sure we pass on the question to the speaker at the opportune time. In case if you're not able to reach out to your question during the session, we'll make sure that we get back to you afterwards. With this, let me introduce our speaker for today. It is my great pleasure to introduce Douglas Ferguson. Douglas is the founder and president of Voltage Control, which is an Austin-based workshop agency that specializes in design sprints and innovation workshops. Prior to Voltage Control, he was the CTO at Voila, a Google Ventures-backed art market. Douglas has conducted numerous design sprints, including several with the members of the Google Venture design team. So without any further ado, I would like to start by asking Douglas, what exactly is a design sprint and why is it so relevant to the lean product management process? Douglas?
So design sprints are super relevant because they help you validate your solution. And in the lean product process, we talk a lot about validation, and typically we get really focused on validating our problem. And there's lots of tools and tactics to do that, and we want to ensure that there's a real problem to solve and that exists in the marketplace, and it's sizable, and people care to have that solved for them. And then we jump into a solution that we think will solve that, and we go build it and then attempt to learn based on that. And those learnings can take a long time, and it takes a long time to build things. And so a design sprint really speeds up that process so that we can get clarity faster and understand if we're on the right track with our solution. And it's a 5-day process to do that. And so I've got a presentation prepared, and I'll walk you through how the process works. Yeah. So as Amit mentioned, my company is Voltage Control, and we do innovation workshops, and we do a lot of design sprints. We got our start doing design sprints, and that evolved out of work that I was doing as a CTO at numerous companies, running product for them. And so who we've worked with. We've done workshops and design sprints for small startups like Favor, agencies like Kung Fu AI, companies like HomeAway, Fidelity, AARP, Dropbox. So you can see that these tools and these approaches can benefit a wide array of companies, and ultimately anyone who's forced or faced with problems that are complex in nature and require numerous diverse points of view to solve for. So at Fidelity, we help them conduct rapid requirements analysis through prototyping and human-centered design research. And specifically, one of the projects I was super pleased to work with was their women's group. So really focused on how they can speak to and help women investors learn and navigate the investment space. Also worked with the Air Force to design next generation training curriculum. They're really faced with this this need to train their pilots faster as they're kind of competing with resources in the private sector. And ultimately it's about creating collaborative relationships and helping people co-create together. And with AARP, we focused on how to help caregivers be more effective and navigate the complex nature of providing care for their loved ones as well as taking care of themselves. So specifically the design sprint. I'd like to walk through the process and give you an overview of how it works and why it works. So what are we going to do? We're going to build and test the prototype in just 5 days. And why do we want to do that? Well, when we think about lean product development, the concept is we're going to come up with an idea, we're going to build it, we're going to launch it, and then we're going to learn from it. Well, the issue is it always takes way longer to build something than we anticipate. Even when we account for the fact that it's going to take a while to build, it always takes longer. And even once we do get it out there and launch it, oftentimes there are things that are defective or things that are wrong about our thinking or about our convictions around the problem space and how the solution fits to that. Those ideas, those concepts are flawed in some way, and it's sometimes hard to detect that with clickstream analytics. And so we're left scratching our heads when users aren't behaving like we expect. And so what we do with the design sprint is we short circuit this loop. So we take our ideas and we seek to learn from them before we bother building and launching it. This is a simulation, so there's still going to be things we learn by once we build and launch, but at least we're being very selective about the things that we send through that build process. So some quick ground rules about a design sprint. The facilitator is in charge of the schedule. It's important to have someone who is an expert facilitator that can keep things on track and make sure that we're doing things accordingly. And one thing to keep in mind, if you are a smaller startup and a resource constrained, you may need to use an internal facilitator, but select someone who's not on the core team, someone who's working on a different project and can bring that unbiased perspective. It's still super valuable. It's also critical that they read the materials, study ahead of time, and know what's ahead of them, what they're responsible for. The decider will make all the tough decisions. So this is the person that we will elect to make the final choice. So a lot of the work that's done in the design sprint is group work, and we'll indicate our preferences through dot voting and other mechanisms of surfacing up the ideas and things that are most critical that we think we should follow through on. But ultimately we elect one person to be in charge. Typically this is the person, this might be the GM, the CEO, the VP who's in charge of the project, and it's going to be able to make the go, no-go decision even after the design sprint. And that's super critical to make sure that we set these things up so that we can continue the momentum afterwards. So we'll clear the room of devices. Of course, we can use them during breaks, but we want to make sure in the room everyone's super focused on the work at hand and dedicated and really honoring the challenge that we set for us to address. Of course, we're going to mind the time timer. The time timer is an iconic design sprint tool, and everyone loves it. So if you're going to do a design sprint, definitely recommend getting one. So a quick preview of the 5 days. So it's starts on Monday, and that's when we map out our problem space. So we're going to get hyper aligned. If you come from an Agile world, I'm sure you're familiar with user stories and how we want to get to a common understanding. Well, this is all about Monday. And so Monday, we will go through some various exercises that will help us get there, and I'll review those in a second. And on Tuesday, we're going to sketch alone. And this is important. We use this diverge, converge dynamics in a lot of the workshops that we do. And so sketching alone allows us to diverge We can go into various different threads that we individually think could be interesting ways to take the solution. And on Wednesday, we're going to converge. So we're going to all get together and review the sketches and decide on what one shows the most promise and where we might be able to best test our assumptions. And then on Thursday, we're going to prototype. So we're going to take that sketch, that winning sketch, and turn it into a high-fidelity prototype that we're going to test with 5 users on Friday. So let's look into mapping on Monday. So we start off with our long-term goal. It's always critical to start off with a clear purpose, and we bake that into all the workshops that we do, and the design sprint is no exception. So we start with this goal, and we get really crisp on what we're trying to accomplish. And, you know, it's important to have a goal in mind when you're going to plan a design sprint because it's a 5-day process and you have to reserve the time and the schedules. The thing we're going to do at the beginning of the day is get really nuanced about it. Make sure that we're all hyper aligned on what it is we're building throughout the week. Then we're going to get really critical on this goal. What's going to get in our way of actually getting there? And that'll help us surface some of these constraints that we need to keep in mind throughout the whole week. It's also a great way to get the pessimism out of the air. We do that at the beginning of the week and then we move on. We'll map out our problem space, and the map is, you know, somewhat similar to a user journey map, but, you know, the fidelity is pretty low. It's very high level. It's meant to just kind of point out the various milestones and touch points that we might move through as we think about the user's experience or and the activities they might perform throughout the process. And what it'll do is it allows us to segment out this concept into different buckets that then we can think about prioritizing the work that we might do in the prototype. So nobody knows everything, so we're going to share. And we do this through a process called Asking the Experts. And that's where we'll invite people in that, that might be able to shed some light on the space we're working on. These could be people with inside your company that might have some perspectives that we don't have in the room or the actual participants. And it could also be people from outside the organization. Maybe these are, you know, maybe we want to bring someone in who knows a bit more about AI so they can shed some light on what's possible there. We're going to get really curious and ask them questions and record them as how might we statements. And these how might we statements are optimistic statements that really capture what the expert is saying and the potential that could have for our solutions. And after we take these notes, we'll sort these, we'll organize them into affinity clusters, and ultimately we'll place them onto our map. And that'll give us a bit of heat and allow us to pick a target on our map that we're going to focus on for prototyping. So Tuesday is our sketch day, and so group brainstorms don't work. And so we're going to sketch alone so that everyone has an equal voice and we can really get our ideas down before we start sharing them as a group. So make sure we have really concrete thoughts and we can put our best feet forward. So the sketches typically look something like this. Actually, just kidding. The reason for these structured formats is that there's consistency, and so when we look at them together, that there'll be these similarities will help us really move past how it's formatted and get to the actual concepts themselves. So the concepts will kind of have an even playing field, and we can compare them more easily. We create the sketches through a 4-step sketch process. And that'll start off with, you know, individual work by taking some notes and moving into kind of an idea kind of phase where we're writing out ideas that we might have based on our notes. And then we do a crazy 8 exercise that allows us to remix and experiment and try new ideas really rapidly. And then ultimately we take all of that and synthesize it down into the sketch that we're going to present out to the team on Wednesday. So again, this individual work. We'll be making the schedules by ourselves. They'll be anonymous as we share out. So then on Wednesday, for a decision, we use the process called a sticky decision. And this is where we want to make sure we make fast decisions and without great groupthink or sales pitches. So we'll put these presentations, these sketches on the walls, and we'll go around and we'll look at them and place dots on them, on the spots where we think that really illustrate things that are really compelling and things that we want to include in our sketches, or rather our prototype. And after putting these dots on the sketches, we can start to create heat around the sketches, around the things that we want to make sure that we include. And then after the dot placing, we do something called a speed critique, where we go around and as a group we talk about the dots that were placed and what surfaced and why we like those things, and really kind of have a bit of just a dialogue about what's compelling. And ultimately, the decider is going to make a call. We do a straw poll voting on the overall sketch, but the decider will say, this is the one that we're going to select and use to build our prototype. And then we'll make a decision around a rumble or an all-in-one. A rumble would be if we're going to pit some of these sketches against each other, or if we're going to maybe combine them together. This will typically happen if the decider can't decide between two. Maybe there's two sketches that they really like, and if those two sketches are complementary, we'll combine them together. If they are kind of diametrically opposed, then we'll actually put them up against each other. We'll make two different brands, and we'll make the two prototypes look like competing products. And then of course we have to storyboard it. And the reason we storyboard is the sketch is really a skeleton, and we want to add some meat to it. We want to get really specific about what we're building, so that we can ensure that there's no questions on Thursday when it's time to prototype. We want to make sure that as we prototype, we can really just go heads down and make it. And so storyboard will be a series of cells. We're drawing arrows from elements on the screen that are going to link to different screens. And it's really a blueprint and like an instruction set for how we're going to go put this prototype together. So again, Thursday's prototype day, and really what we're looking for is a realistic facade. We just need enough to convince the user that this thing exists and allow them to react to it. So we're using tools like Envision, Marvel. We've even had people use PowerPoint before. The ultimate thing to understand is that we're not writing software. We're just really quickly simulating that this thing exists. Another important point to note is that it's not wireframes. This is high fidelity. We don't want any ambiguity, because if there's ambiguity in what we show people, that ambiguity is going to transcend into the feedback that we get. So everyone is involved as much as possible. It's kind of all hands on deck to get this done, because we only have a day to put this together, and so it's a pretty exciting and action-packed day for sure. We can make mobile prototypes using Envision and other tools that can simulate mobile prototypes using just kind of hyperlinked images. This is an example of a rumble, two different mobile apps that solving the same problem but in different ways. We use different brands and treatments so that the user doesn't realize that they're comparing two potential ways we might go. We want them to think, oh, these are two things that are out there, and how do I feel about one versus the other? You can prototype packaging, physical things, 3D printers to prototype hardware or physical objects. You can even prototype an office space with actors reading out a script and a new way of engaging with customers. The important thing is just to really ensure that you're in a prototyping mindset, and how do we simulate and learn from the assumptions and our critical questions that we start off on Monday. And then of course on Friday we're going to test with 5 users, and 5 customers are enough to reveal the big patterns. And this is some research that was done by the Nielsen-Norman group, and it demonstrates that you get 80% of your results with 5 users. Now you have to make sure that your sample that you're testing against is representative of the whole, and that you aren't mixing up different segments, and that you hear consistent things from all 5 users. That's all pretty critical. But this is a very useful technique, and it surprises quite a lot of people because we aren't talking about statistical significance. We really just want to look for trends. Now, if we're trying to understand if a green button is going to convert better than a yellow button, then of course we want to test with a lot of users. But here we're just looking for general sentiment and trends, and you can get within 5 users. So, our goal is we're going to fast forward into the future. We want to understand how this thing might work if we build it and put it out there. And so we might learn that through these one-on-one interviews that this is a really bad idea, and we just save 6 months of development time. Typically, if we do have a win, it's a flawed win, and so there might be things that we want to tweak and adjust before we go and build it out further. And of course, the team's going to watch from another room so that they're learning and gathering these insights so that they can see it firsthand. It's super important to hear the user directly versus reading somebody's synthesized report. And of course, we're going to identify patterns. This is an example of one of the tools we built called the Design Sprint Scorecard. And so as you're listening to the testers, you can refer back to some of your critical questions and even new questions we wrote about the prototype. We're not going to ask these questions of the user, but we listen in to see if there are moments where that becomes apparent and we can answer yes or no. And then we can generate a report at the end to see how we landed overall with the design sprint. So at the end, we'll generally know what to do. It's often helpful to fix the prototype and test again, assuming we didn't figure out that the user absolutely didn't want it. Then we might adjust our prototype and test again, and then adjust the prototype and test again until we get something that we're really confident in. Then we can send it through a development process. And of course, there'll still be more learnings to have once it gets into the wild, but we're really putting our best foot forward. So with that, I'd like to hand it back over to Amit to talk a little bit about Synergit.
Right. And just before that, Douglas, this was wonderful. I mean, great insights here. But let me just kind of go back to, the first question pertaining to the prerequisites, right? So like you mentioned, once you start the design sprint, you kind of come up with the external facilitators, the deciders, and so on. But I think you would like to know a little more about, what are some of those prerequisites specifically from a stakeholder standpoint? I mean, whom do you get into that room for that decision making? You normally run into challenges where people don't have the time and there's a pushback. So how do you deal with those kind of things?
Yeah, there's quite a bit there to unpack. I would say that as far as dealing with the availability, for me, that's always a red flag. If we are hearing that, we can't free up enough of the schedule, then it may not be a big enough challenge to warrant a design sprint. So there's this notion of, is the challenge big enough? Is it important enough for the company? And if so, then making time is the most critical way or the most effective way to move things forward. And so if folks continue the status quo and continue to just run from meeting to meeting, not necessarily moving any project forward as rapidly as it could, then that will play itself out. That's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so if there are things that are critical to the business to launch, and we don't want to just do business as usual and let 6 months pass and realize we never really prioritized it or got anything done, then it's a great reason to clear the schedule and get it and do it. Now, as far as the prerequisites, it's important to understand the problem space and what you're seeking to address. And so, upfront research is helpful. so that you understand the problem space. I talked a bit about the design sprint being great at solution validation. Well, ideally, you've done some problem validation. You understand where the problem lies and what the players are, and who are the actors in this problem space, and you're coming in armed with that knowledge, and often, you know, there's generally some notion of solutions that we might want to explore that can be really helpful, but not a requirement. And then as far as attendees, we typically, you know, the classic list of attendees that's in the book are, you know, you're typically looking for about 7 people, and we want to make sure that someone's there that understands the logistics. So in a software company, that'd probably be a developer. You, of course, need a maker, someone to build a prototype. That's typically a designer, but again, when we're talking about different kinds of prototypes, there might you might have a screenwriter. You might having someone who understands the voice of the brand and can write content is really helpful. Also, someone who understands the customer. So maybe someone from customer support or sales. Someone who understands the financial model can be really helpful. And then ultimately, that decider role. You know, who's going to ultimately be responsible? Who can make that go no go decision and ensure that we continue to have momentum? And ultimately, that person can delegate to someone else, but it should be intentional and not something that just happens. If we have a very clear dialogue about, okay, I'm going to give them authority to run with this thing versus I don't have time to do it, so you go do it.
Right. Absolutely. I think then that gets me to that next question of mine. What are those kinds of problems that you can actually pick up for a design sprint, right? Because that's a common challenge which probably the development team or the product team would have. That is it going to be an open-ended problem statement that you want to take in, or is it a very specific one? Your thoughts on this, Douglas?
Yeah, I think it lies somewhere in the middle. Because if it's too open-ended and too broad and huge, then we probably haven't done enough refinement to ensure that we've got some focus. So it has to be guided and targeted based on some strategy that we're about to implement. Now, so often what we'll do leading into a design sprint, if we feel it's a little too broad, we'll do some problem framing exercises just to kind of focus it down a bit. But certainly broader is better than too narrow, because if it's too narrow, if it's just like, how might we make this new feature, then it's not going to be something that you're going to want to clear a schedule for 5 days and go deeply on. That being said, there's no reason why you can't use some of these principles and approaches for feature development. You probably just you won't need to bring together the cross-functional team for 5 days with all the structure. And in fact, after a design sprint, we'll often see people reuse their prototype as an evergreen asset that they'll refer back to and help with feature development so if they had a feature that popped up, they're like, oh, we need to explore this a little more, they can lean back on the prototype they already have going and just add that feature into it.
Okay, sure, makes sense. So let me take an example just to kind of clarify this further. So suppose if there's a problem statement to formulate a strategy for increasing the online marketplace conversion by, say, 100 basis point or the overall sell-through, is this a good problem to kind of take down and then break it down to a more consumable form?
I mean, it can be. For something that broad, I'd want to understand how much research has been done and how much they know about opportunities that they could potentially explore. And so that would be one where we might do a problem framing exercise prior to the design sprint, just to make sure that, like, okay, like we have enough understanding about the direction we could go, and let's chart that journey together. If not, then I think that might be more of a kind of a strategic planning workshop, or maybe some research that needs to be done prior to kind of feeding that into a design sprint. Because another thing too to keep in mind is it really depends on how open folks are to maybe things that diverge from their expectations. Like,
Right.
Because if someone were to present something really broad to me like that, and they're like, and their focus was to discover or to build new software, and this is really wide problem, I'd be a little more apprehensive versus if they had a broad problem and then they had also a broad perspective on where it might go. Because often, we can solve things without software. There might be process changes that we make. There might be new marketing things that we do, or just new ways that we approach the problem. So I think if the mindset is right, it's easier to go into super broad things.
Absolutely. Specifically for, products which are in the emerging fields, so say, for example, artificial intelligence or, areas which use machine learning. So where probably the market is still nascent, would you say that for complex projects like these and areas, do you think, maybe what are some of the prerequisites to kind of tackle such things in a design sprint?
Yeah. It again can really depend on the organization itself. So if I kind of come back to Andy Grove's notion of task-oriented maturity, right? Because we might have a super mature team. They've got amazing development processes. They're really good at what they do. But now we're dipping into AI, and they've never done it before. Maybe they've started to read white papers, and so they can kind of get through a white paper without having to scratch their head a lot. Or maybe they're not even at that point, right? But certainly not implementing algorithms, and so in those scenarios, it's important to understand where people are on this maturity curve, and also important that they understand where they are so that they can properly they can kind of navigate it in a way that it's going to lead to productive outcomes. Because what we don't want to do is get into an idea fest that is not feasible. Because a design sprint is really about getting an understanding around desirability of the solution, and if there's that solution problem fit. And we don't really spend a ton of time on feasibility, because if we think too much about feasibility, then it can really limit our ideation and where we might take it. But that said, we don't want to throw feasibility to the wind, right? Because then, that's a great way to lose momentum, because none of this is realistic. And so to be able to walk that balance between being creative and explorative, but also ensuring that we're kind of conscious of what's possible, there needs to be some level of education there. We'll often use the experts on Monday to do some of that, or we'll do some upfront education and research to help kind of frame the group. We also have a workshop that we do. We call it the AI readiness workshop, and we've open sourced it. It's on our blog, and that's a great way for teams to kind of address their AI maturity as a cross-functional team. So we don't get into details around algorithms and whatnot, but it's more about where we are as far as capabilities and data cleanliness and these kinds of things.
Sure thing. So any specific industry, or let's say a product stage, so if there's a startup, is design sprint more suited for a startup versus, if you have a legacy enterprise application? Would you say that it is more attuned or, directed more towards the startup culture?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'll point out that Jake created the process at Google while working on a fairly small project. you know, there was a Google, at the time there was a Google 20% time, and he was working on Hangouts and using the time to do it and realizing that, you know, there's got to be a better way to work on these projects so that we can get more momentum, because he felt like they were just kind of doing a little, you know, working on the stuff and, you know, not really getting the traction. And so he put together some tools and a framework that was the seed to the design sprint, and saw so much progress compared to what they had done for months and months of kind of working in other ways. And once he saw that potential, that what got him really inspired to kind of pursue it more. And then ultimately moving to Google Ventures, where he road tested it with numerous Google Ventures portfolio companies. And so you can kind of view it as tailor fit for that later stage startup, where, you know, they see opportunity, they want to explore it more deeply, but it's not super clear on what you know, what the next step might be. The classic Slack example is, you know, they were looking at this onboarding challenge, and they weren't sure, should we they had a product, had one idea, the CEO had another, and, you know, they were competing ideas, and both took a long time, to, like 6 months to build. And so, you know, we weren't going to build both and A/B test them. And so let's prototype it and simulate it. So I think the principles apply to everybody. And when you're talking about early stage startups, they're just too small, and they don't have a large enough team to where they need the structure to get the results. And so so for those, I recommend applying the principles. So let's prototype, let's get these in front of users and learn from it before we go build. And it's just the nature of the beast when you start to get to larger organizations, where whether it's a later stage startup or a corporate or even a public sector organization, you get to a point where the structure and the process is required to ensure that you move quickly and you get the work done.
Okay, that's good. Like you mentioned, Douglas, I think, you know, having that validation phase is extremely important from a product perspective. So in these 5 days of the design sprint, what is the user representation expected? I mean, if you have subject matter experts from the stakeholder board, is that voice sufficient to be considered as a user's voice, or do you actually need, you know, users to be on the team for those 5 days?
So it depends. Typically, we don't have users participate in the sprint. That's just not classically. We have done that before, especially if we're co-creating. So take an example of a company that was wanting to partner with another company and on a project, and technically the partner was going to be the consumer of the software they got built, and so we brought them into the design sprint and they co-created together. I think it's more common on this B2B side, because the diversity of the types of users and the I would say maybe the intimacy of the relationship is
Right.
higher. So it's just easier to think about and to realize. Typically on a consumer product, or we're bringing the users in on Friday for the testing. But that said, we're also bringing in a lot of research and bringing in people that work with the user all the time and are very intimately aware of their problems and issues. And that's who we would typically bring into the design sprint. In the case of a B2B2C, we typically it's nice to have that partner or some representative on the B side, but we don't typically bring in the consumer.
Okay, makes sense. So what are some of the tools or the methodologies that we use in the design sprints? I mean, in terms of trying to capture the user's journey or the experience map, like we mentioned, what are some of those tools and what are the key outputs in the design sprint?
Yeah, so we developed a couple tools that are widely used. One is we call the scorecard, which I briefly displayed in my presentation. We use Google Sheets to build that, and we also have a mod guide that's fairly widely used, and another that was also used with Google Suite, and then Mural is a really handy tool that we'll use if there's any times when we might be working remotely. So sometimes on prototype day, some members of the team will work remotely, even if they're in the room next door. It's just a great tool for us to kind of collaboratively work on pulling assets together and getting things done. So we'll even make a little Kanban board on Mural and move the note cards across and that sort of stuff. Of course, something to build the prototype in. So typically InVision, Marvel, some people use PowerPoint even. Flinto is a new one that a lot of people like. People are kind of divided on that one because it's an in-the-cloud design tool. And so you actually don't have a file anymore. It's similar to Google Docs in that sense. And I think that loss of control is a little foreign to some people, but we may see more of a shift to that over time. And yeah, of course, there's more kind of process kind of tools like the note and vote, for instance, permeates the entire design sprint, and that's just a process where we couple that individual work with group work. So individually, you'll write down your thoughts and lists, and then we'll share out as a group, and then ultimately vote on the winners, which is how we come up with the questions, as well as we use it other times throughout the week too. But that's the first time it surfaces when we think about those critical questions on Monday.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for that. So generally you mentioned, the design sprint is for 5 days, and I see a lot of questions coming up pertaining to this. Are there any cases where you feel the need to run a compressed sprint, so reducing the duration to maybe 2 or 3 days? What kind of cases require that kind of a treatment?
Yeah, there's quite a bit of information around this, and I guess succinctly I would say that when Jake left Google, the team at Google continued to develop the process more, and their approach to design sprints is much more it's less structured and prescriptive, and more like a set of tools that you can use and potentially draw from, and a very high-level framework around Converge and Diverge. And so they'll do design sprints, or they'll do workshops they call design sprints that might be 100 people that only last 1 day.
Okay.
And then you'll also see there's some writing out there about the design sprint 2.0, which is a 4-day process, and someone else has a 3-day process. Ultimately, from the voltage control perspective, we run them pretty much by the book with a few hacks and tweaks for efficiency. It can be done in 4 days. Typically, if you're going to do it in 4 days, it requires more upfront work, and we have to lock in some of those understandings and some of the decisions. For instance, I talked about, sometimes you can go in with a really broad goal and kind of refine it a bit during the design sprint. Well, if you're doing a 4-day design sprint, you really have to have that locked in and decided going into it. And then I think if we're getting down to where we're getting down to 3 days, etc., it's starting to adapt and change more, so much so that I typically will just refer to it as an innovation workshop. It doesn't mean I'm not drawing inspiration from a design sprint, but it's probably not quite a design sprint at that point.
Sure, absolutely. Absolutely. So based on your experience, I mean, you've run, multiple design sprint workshops. I'm sure you've faced a lot of challenges, running, in some cases. Would you kind of, talk about some interesting anecdotes?
So, yeah. So anything in particular as far as the type of anecdote that you think you'd like to hear?
Yeah, I mean, specifically in terms of, when you start off, maybe, day one kind of, as you start mapping probably, and maybe, you face a challenge in kind of, converging on an area to pick so that you can go ahead and prototype. Maybe something around that have you ever faced?
Sure, sure. Yeah, the map is an interesting one. The map and the storyboard are the two most challenging to facilitate and for teams to even to get through. The problem with the map is that it can be quite nebulous, and usually the team hasn't thought about the problem space in this way, which is why it's so powerful. But some people get hung up on the fact that it's messy and they don't really see where it's headed, and that gives them concern. It makes them uncomfortable. And my advice is always to, it's going to be messy, embrace it, just go through the process, because the act of doing the work is what's going to surface the understanding and the epiphanies, those aha moments, as we kind of just navigate through it together visually. And so that's something that happens every time, and just something to be aware of. Often I'll be standing at the whiteboard and have no idea what to draw. And the thing is you have to put something. It doesn't even matter if it's right or wrong. Like, as soon as I put something on the whiteboard, that's something for the team to react to. And so that's my biggest tip as a facilitator, is just get it started. Know that it's messy. Be okay with that. Make sure the team's okay with that. And then the other thing about the map is you'll want to, or the team, especially engineers, they want to go down into the nitty-gritty, deep internals of the process, the cool thing that makes it tick, the algorithm, right? What's the feature or what's the function that makes this thing really sing, and let's figure out that. And that's like, usually that's like 3 steps too deep into the process, and instead we need to be prototyping the landing page and the onboarding process, because that's where we're going to understand how the user even thinks about what we're trying to do with this algorithm, right? Whereas if we throw them deep into the belly and they're using it, like, sure, we might get some feedback on that usability, but like, how do they even think about like what we're trying to offer? And so usually I'm having to steer people or nudge them a bit, or make sure they're considering the fact of like, what is our riskiest assumptions and where do we need to learn?
Absolutely. And I think, like you rightly said, right, I mean, working through that, sticky situation or the chaos, I think getting to, converge the ideas is important. So, I mean, that gets me to that question of really, how do you measure the success of a design sprint?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite topics, and I think this actually goes nicely around, or aligns nicely with just measuring innovation in general. And there's some information out there about innovation accounting, and the one thing I'll say is often people want to go straight into ROI, and it's super important to think about what are the adjacent and maybe even soft wins of some of this work. So that's something important to think about. Did we expose learnings and opportunities that will impact us in ways that the actual project may not? So that's something to always keep in mind. And the way we do that is through retrospectives. So always encourage people to do a retrospective after the sprint so that they're synthesizing and reviewing the learnings, as well as thinking about what things surface, what opportunities have exposed themselves, and how the group is impacted. And even tighter bonds that we might have made between marketing and sales, or marketing and development, or whatever it is, we need to record and acknowledge those things so we can share them and attribute them to the process. Also, if we realize that we should not go build this thing because it's not going to do what we expect, we can actually very easily calculate what we saved, as far as like in 5 days we figured out what would have taken us maybe 6 months and tons of resources versus just 7 people. So that's really big. And then as far as measuring successes on the outcomes of the kind of the flawed win or any of the wins we've done, that again is about looking at the insights that we gained as well as the momentum that we created for the project. And so if you compare that to how long it typically takes you to launch projects, then that's a pretty good rubric to think about, like how the design sprint improved things and moved things along. And I'm also just like to put a plug in. I'll be publishing a book about how to build on the momentum of a design sprint and ensure you get the most out of it, and even what to do after a design sprint. That's going to be coming out in early this summer.
That is great, Douglas. Great to hear that, and look forward to that publication. So one additional question that is coming up is, how do we converge a design sprint with a lean or an agile process like Scrum, where you have the development team coming in and kind of taking over? So how do you kind of merge or marry these two things together?
Yes, I love that question, and I actually wrote a blog post called "Friends Not Enemies," because there's some confusion in the market around Agile versus design sprints, and and also just because it has the word sprint in it, people get confused about oh, we do design sprints. Well, actually, I think you're thinking about development sprints, but and my take on it is that the design sprint and processes like it, if you're really borrowing from the rapid prototyping mindset, is a great way to seed the work that you do in your agile sprints. And so you think about the path that you're on and the roadmap ahead of you. Well, this is a fantastic way to shed light on that, get clarity, and build a more crisp blueprint so that you can create an understanding, a high fidelity understanding around what's going to get built. And also, it's an awesome concrete asset that is very, I would say, clear, because instead of using words to align, we can look at this visual and say, oh, this is exactly what we're building, versus someone saying, oh, when you said maroon, I thought you meant red, right? And then, so we can get past some of those inconsistencies. It can be really powerful. But again, this is work that's been being done ahead of the agile development process and just starting to feed into it. And so the two can really marry each other quite nicely.
Sure, great. Sounds good. So I encourage all the participants to kind of keep adding the questions. I'll give you all a couple minutes, and in the meantime, let me just quickly talk about what Synergip does, and then maybe we'll take the rest of the questions. So Douglas, can you just go to the next slide, please? Yeah, thank you. So Cinezip is the trusted Agile software co-development partner. Typically, clients, we've been in business for the last 14 years, and clients come to us for one of the following reasons. One is essentially to accelerate the delivery of the product and the UX roadmap, and we help them shape up their GTM strategies by employing lean product development philosophy. In case of any skill gaps in at the client teams, we kind of fill in with requisite resources who kind of fill those gaps. Some of the advantages that come along, obviously, based on the distributed way of working, is the cost advantages. We also offer dual shore business models to ensure convenient collaboration. Next slide, please, Douglas. Some of the clients, this is just a small list of clients that we've worked with. So as you see, we've worked with top fortune companies, mid-sized companies, or venture funds. So typically all of these are referenceable clients. We have an exhaustive list on the website, and you can find testimonials for your reference too. Okay, next slide, please. Right. There's also an upcoming webinar which I just wanted to kind of highlight. It is about the progressive web app applications, which is on Thursday, the June 27th. It is going to be presented by Nikhil Warwekar, who is a senior solution architect at Cinezip, and he'll be talking about PWA and how it has emerged, in the current market scenario. So I think that will be interesting. Please do join in for reference. Okay, let me quickly take a look at the questions that are flowing in. Okay, there's a question from Sagar who says, when does sprint call as done? Is it when all the tasks picked up on day one are prototyped and tested? So essentially, he's asking about when do you call it done? Douglas.
Yeah, so generally we consider the design sprint done when at the end of Friday. Now, as I said, sometimes we might continue on with the prototype and iterate on it, but the design sprint itself ends on Friday once we've tested our prototype with 5 users. Now, your question around is it done when you prototype with all the things from Monday? There might be a lot of things that surface on Monday, but ultimately at the end of the day on Monday, we're pick one specific target on the map, and then we move through. So you can kind of think of it as a filter. We're going to start the day off with the goal, which is pretty wide, right? That's the top of the funnel. And then we're going to start filtering it down using various activities to focus our efforts. And so selecting that spot on the map is one of our big filtering moments where we say, oh, this is where we're going to focus. And then on Wednesday, when we pick a specific sketch that we're going to prototype, that's again another filter. There's no reason you can't go back and revisit some of those things, but that might be just additional work, or it might be it might lead into another design sprint. But the design sprint itself it ends on Friday. You could argue that it doesn't technically end until you've done your retrospective and talk about the outcomes. We typically recommend people do that the week after, just so that you have some time to sleep on the observations.
Okay, great. I think we just have time for maybe one more question. It's a question from Eduardo. Can the design sprint be run with remote participants, or is it important that all the stakeholders to be in the same room? If so, any risks, caveats, lessons learned?
Yeah, it is possible to run them remotely. I would say that in order to do that, you have to have a really committed team. I generally recommend it's having a blend of remote and local is difficult. Maybe if there's one remote person and they're super committed and there's just nothing they can do about getting to the rest of the group, then that's another way to do it. The trick is, as a facilitator, it's really difficult to know if people are lost or confused or doing something wrong, or until they submitted it, and then now you kind of lost that time when they were working on it. And so I would say for folks that do run remote design sprints, they typically use Mural, and we run a few remote ones. Our preference is to work together in person, but we're always exploring and experimenting with different things. So my recommendation is just to tread cautiously. Definitely check out Mural, and be just really sure that everyone's totally on board, and that the reason that you're doing it remotely is not because people aren't bought in enough to travel.
Sure, absolutely. I think we're at the end of our webinar time, so I think we might have to curtail the number of questions we have. But I think Douglas, this has been a great learning experience. In terms of talking about the nuances of design sprints and its relevance to lean product management. It was a pleasure having you here, Douglas. Thank you so much. And for all who joined in, thank you very much once again.
Yeah, thank you. And I would say if anyone has any additional questions, I'm easy to locate, and we're happy to put them on the page, the webinar page, post answers there as well. So feel free to submit answers to Amit or directly to me, and we'll get them answered for you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.